It's a great privilege and pleasure to have Dr. Nikolaus Ruge from the University of Trier with us. He gave the lecture series last year already, so you might have seen him virtually online in the lecture series, but it's particularly appropriate that he's coming back this year since this volume has just come out. There should be hopefully a copy in all of your college libraries, because I asked all the college librarians to buy one, but there's also an online license for 3 simultaneously copies to be consulted. And when I was looking at that, I realized that in Oxford we are uniquely well placed actually to teach this specific lecture series, since several of the seminal textbook authors have taught here in Oxford in the same room. I've parked currently as foundation for the laptop here the book by Chris Wells, German up to 1945. So Chris Wells was lecturer in historical linguistics at St. Edmund Hall, my own college, and it was really, I think, the first attempt to bring together linguistic and cultural history. So he was more or less responsible for designing the course as you are experiencing it today, to taking in forms like forms of address, which might not be the usual hardcore linguistics topic, or language of totalitarianism, which I think is more important than ever if we look around the world at war rhetoric and the emphasis of maligning others. So I think language awareness is really a key skill across the periods and will stand you in good stead also when studying literature. Below Chris Wells, I should have put it the other way around, because Howard Jones and Martin Jones were really building on Chris Wells, is our main textbook really for the first part of the series, the introduction to Middle High German. And don't be scared of the breadth and width of it. Linguists are very good in structuring information, so if you dare to plunge into it from the start, you'll be guided through with what a favorite German idiom is, with a roter Faden, a red thread lining you through. Also here as a lecturer in historical linguistics on the same program as Nikolaus Ruge, 5 years ago was Simone Schulz-Balluf, and her lectures, which were actually in German, can still be listened to on the Canvas page. So if you want to complement listening to the lectures in English with a lecture series in German, which is quite appropriate because her approach was to teach Middle High German as if it were a modern foreign language, so kind of full immersion, as if you were sent on an exchange and trying to have a conversation with a Pariser Gesprächspartner.
She wanted a time machine, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. So she used a lot of very pragmatic text, recipe books, conversation guides. It's a fun read, and it also has a Lösungsschlüssel going with it. So you can test yourself as you might do with problem sheets for modern German grammar. But now to come to the book in question, we discovered that actually at least 3 people in the room have been taught with earlier incarnations of this book. I just rescued this book from 1973, which was do you remember which edition it was?
The first.
That's the first edition, which was bought by Chris Wells for the St. Edmund Hall Library, and which they now chucked out because it's replaced by Alt- und Mittelhochdeutsch 11th edition. This is my own hand-bound copy when I started in Bamberg studying in 1989. So I had the fourth edition to teach us, and then the next one in line is Nikolaus. Which edition did you?
The fourth as well, I think.
Yeah, just in the beginning. And then one of our other lecturers, Josh, if you want to come up.
Yeah, so which edition did we realise it was?
The eighth.
The 8th edition was mine. Looks a lot more like this. It was the first with the QR codes and a website. So yeah, I did this course you're doing myself quite a while ago, and began learning Middle High German in my German linguistics course, and then was lucky enough to spend some time over in Trier, which is where I was taught using this book, which I would really recommend given the fact that it's in German. So you can work on your Middle High German and work on your modern German all in one go. It is a really good book. It lays things out very clearly and is nice and easy to follow. And it's a really good complement to the other books. Howard Jones taught me for the lectures when I was doing Middle High German. We didn't have that useful book, which would have been very great. But yeah, so now I went on, did my master's, DPhil, and work a lot with Middle High German still. So it's still keeping me busy. Yeah, and now I'm teaching some of you.
Thanks a lot. Before handing over to Nikolaus, just to say, looking at different editions of the same book isn't only a kind of indulging in one's own past, but can also be a source of really interesting cultural history. I discussed it with some of my paper 4 tutees on Monday. So this is a history of the German language, which I really like, Wilhelm Schmidt, which came out of the GDR. And if you compare the GDR editions with the Postwende editions, you can learn a lot of how language and politics are intertwined. So Middle High German is the feudal Sprache of the Höfe, which are very critically viewed, and Luther is the liberator of the German language and a great defender of the people, which was a line the party took from 1983 onward, when the 500th anniversary of Luther's birth was, and they realized that he was a real tourist magnet. So they had to reevaluate his position in the Proletarier-Geschichte. So there you have a take on the Middle Ages through to early New High German, which is a Klassenkampf-Geschichte, and very interesting to see that reflected. So I'd encourage you to read widely as well for cultural insights as for linguistic insights across these different books, and never to take anything for granted and believe it at first sight, but always be critical. All right, with that word, over to you, Nikolaus.
Thank you, Enrique. Welcome. Glad to be back in Oxford. So I'll start right away with an outline of what to expect in this term. I'll start with some general considerations. One of the most common German texts from the Middle Ages, you guessed it maybe, is the Bible. In particular, the New Testament. As such, it makes sense for us to consult the German version of the Gospels from that time to get an impression of what constitutes Middle High German. Here on the slide, you can see 3 translations of Matthew 13, 45 to 46, which older scholars describe as Middle High German period. Without going into detail at this stage, you can clearly see that the 3 manuscripts, which are all different versions of the same text passage, show clear linguistic differences, which I would like to briefly explain. Let us first begin with a few words about each of the three sources. The Wolfenbüttler Evangelista was written around the year 1300 and is of East-Central German provenance, which roughly corresponds to the area of today's federal states of Thuringia, Saxony, and the southern part of Brandenburg and Saxony-Anhalt. The Augsburg Bible can be dated precisely to the year 1350 on the basis of a scribe's note and comes from the north of the Bavarian-speaking area, roughly corresponding to today's Franconia. The dating of the Olomouc pericopes is controversial, and estimates range from 1300 to the second half of the 14th century. There are good reasons for both assessments. The location of origin is less problematic. For Olomouc, it's Bavarian. Now to some differences. Where the Wolfenbüttel and Augsburg manuscripts have long E, the Olomouc manuscripts have the diphthong I. E, I. Where the Augsburg manuscripts have the voiced label plosive B, verborgen, verbirget, we have the voiceless label plosive P in the Olomouc version. The differences concern not only the sound and their spelling, but also the morphology. While the Wolfenbüttel manuscript has, without exception, is, as the third person singular present indicative of Middle High German, seen, to be, the other manuscripts have ist in red. The same distribution can be seen in the third person personal pronouns in green. In the masculine singular, he appears in the Olomouc manuscripts compared to er in the other versions. In the plural, which is in blue, Olomouc has the compared to sei or they in the Wolfenbüttel and Augsburg manuscripts. We see variation of this kind between the different manuscripts and even within the same manuscript. Example. In the Olomouc pericopes, the third person plural present indicative of Middle High German kaufen, to buy, appears with one single F, kauft, in Matthew 13:45, but with double F, kauft, in Matthew 13:46. We can see from these three manuscripts how time and geography, or to put it simply, space, are important factors in linguistic variation. As such, I will now give a brief overview of how Middle High German varies diachronically and diatopically. There were very few unifying norms and standards at the time, and it is of note that such written variation was accepted by scribes of the Middle High German age. For this reason, I will also touch upon certain sociolinguistical aspects of the Middle High German tradition. At the end of today's lecture, I would also, Henrik announced it already, like to use the recent publication of the 11th edition of the Alt- und Mittelhochdeutsch Arbeitsbuch as an opportunity to reflect on how a non-standard language, like Middle High German, can or should be taught. But first, chapter time. The temporal aspect of Middle High German is of interest to us for two reasons at least. First, I will briefly address the question of the extent to which it is even possible to assess the historical development of language during the Middle High German period. This preliminary consideration seems important to me since it's the historical character of languages that will form the basis of the next sessions, in which I will give you a longitudinal representation of Middle High German based on evidence from the textual tradition. The periodization model on which this longitudinal representation is based is the second reason to examine the temporal dimension of the Middle High German language period in more detail. Essentially, the fact that natural languages undergo changes over time was by no means unknown in the Middle Ages. However, this knowledge is often modeled in such a way that it is difficult or even impossible for historical linguists to meaningfully appraise it. The best known of these models, and the one most widely received up to the 14th century, is the Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel. You're probably familiar with the story, but I would like to briefly retell it to you using the version of the Schlierbach Old Testament, which was most likely written in the first half of the 14th century. It is attributed to the so-called Austrian Bible translator, whose significance for the history of the German language I will return to in more detail in the session on late Middle High German. So for these longer sections of text, I will read you the Middle High German version, but you'll have the translation on the slide, which should make it easier to follow, I guess. Und do die Leut nach der Sintflucht gemehrt wurden und das Erdreich hin und her besessen hätten, do kommen die von Orient in das Land Senaa, Donu, Babylon leid und ließen sich da nieder. Und einer sprach zu dem andern, wir sollen uns Ziegel brennen und nehmen Harz an des Mortars statt und bauen uns allhie ein Stadt und einen Turm, der an den Himmel gereich, dass unser allhie gedacht werde, dass wir in die Welt hin und her geteilt wurden. Nu war es zu den Zeiten nur ein Sprach auf allem Erdreich. Sprechen die Meister, das sei die Hebraisprach gewesen. Du bezornet Gott, der Leut Pau und sandt seinen Gewalt an soll, mit manniger Hände, sprach, dass einer den anderen nicht vernahm und wurden also geschenkt mit manniger Hände, sprach, als sie noch heut in der Wälde hin und her sind. Und mussten von dem Bau lassen und wurden also in die Wälde gestreut und davon wird dieselbe Stadt Babylon genannt, das spricht, ein Stadt der Schanden, wann sie zu Schanden all da wurden. What is the problem with using such a passage in historical linguistics? Firstly, language change is not explained by the usual mechanism of contact, but instead by divine intervention. In other words, through a miracle. Of course, there's nothing wrong to use miracles to explain language change in language, should you wish to, but that would make you a theologian, not a linguist. Secondly, the linguistic developments mentioned in the passage are not treated with impartiality, but are instead interpreted negatively as divine punishment for human hubris. Nevertheless, this prejudiced perception of linguistic change persists even when scholarly doubts about the Babylon myth creep in towards the end of the Middle Ages. We can see how the view was abandoned in no uncertain terms in Dante's Divine Comedy, complete in 1321, when Adam, in the 26th canto of Paradise, moved the beginning of the history of language back to before the building of the tower. La lingua ch'io parlai fu tutta spenta, innanzi calora inconsumabile, forse la gente di nembrot attenta. In addition to the Babylon myth, there are other sources from the Middle Ages that offer some value to for the historical linguist. The most influential in this respect is a passage from Isidore's Etymologies, which, according to Arno Borst, was, quote, the first major draft of a Latin language history that has come down to us, unquote. Latinas autem linguas quattuor esse, quidam dixerunt, it est priscam Latinam Romanam mixtam. Prisca est, quam vetustissimi Italiae Subiano et Saturnus sunt usi incognita, ut se habent carmina saliorum. Latina quam sub Latino et regibus Tusci etc. in Latius sunt locuti, ex qua fuerunt duodecim tabulae scriptae. Romana, quae post regis exactus a populo Romano crypta est. Quae Naevius, Plautus, Ennius, Vergilius Poete, et ex oratoribus Gracchus et Cato et Cicero vel ceteri effuderunt. Mixta, quae post imperium Latius promotum simul comoribus et hominibus in Romanam civitatem inrupit, integritatem verbi per soloicismus et barbarismus corrumpens. Although Isidore's etymologies came into being in the early Middle Ages, the text remained influential into the early modern period, especially as material used in an educational context. The etymologies have survived in almost 1,000 handwritten texts and were printed in Augsburg by Günther Zeiner as early as 1472. What is striking about the passage, in addition to the innovative focus on the history of language, is that here too linguistic change is presented as a process of decay, and of course, the language being discussed is Latin, the medium of clerical written culture. In contrast, contemporary vernacular sources which offer any sort of historical perspective on Middle High German are few and far between. I'm actually only aware of one thematically relevant text, the dating of which also raises questions. It survives in a manuscript from the 15th century, but it discusses linguistic developments which belong to the Middle High German period. The anonymous author of the pamphlet entitled Neudeutsch by the first editor, Josef von Lassberg, in the 1820s, condemns the emergence of certain lexicosemantic innovations. In particular, improper usages such as Middle High German blenden, literally to blind somebody, here used in the sense of to deceive, pejoratively motivated turns of phrase such as du Augen ausfressen, literally to eat somebody's eyes out, here to be angry with somebody, and euphemistically motivated expressions such as Reis, literary journey, here signifying war. All these cause him particular frustration. His argumentation, based on a temporal dimension, is noteworthy, but superficially at least, does not integrate the traditional model of language decay. Instead, he complains about semantic innovations against the background of Germanic and Romance contact in foreign language didactics. I read the passage to you. Eins heißt so, das ander sus. Ich seid es in einem Jahr nicht us, was man neuer Tutsche hat. Mein Herz gar in Wunderstaat, wie ein frömmender welcher Mann jemmer Tutsch gelernen kann. However, such a criticism of semantic innovations by Romance language learners turns out to be questionable when considering the type of terms that are being scrutinized. If we concentrate on the contact between Middle High German and Old French, it can be shown that several of these neologisms are also found in Old French, so it is hard to conceive that the terms were difficult to learn. For example, the article criticizes the use of verwund sein, to be injured, to express the notion of being madly in love, a meaning which is well attested for the Old French verbs est gêné, to harm, and navrer, to wound, from as early as the 12th century. However, this does not change the significance of the source for the historical linguist, as it is our first attestation of language change phenomena concerning Middle High German expressed in Middle High German. But let us now turn to how the diachronic development of Middle High German tends to be modeled. Firstly, Middle High German is temporally delineated from older and younger language periods. The most common periodization model distinguishes 4 stages. Old High German, from the earliest records around 750 to about 1050, Middle High German 1050 to 1350, early New High German 1350 to 1650, Modern High German from 1650 to the present. It is important to underscore that this periodization is just one possible way of modeling German over time. Jakob Grimm, the first to propose such a model for German, only distinguished 3 periods: Old High German, Middle High German, and New High German. For Grimm, the Middle High German period stretched to 1450. Ever since Wilhelm Scherers Geschichte der deutschen Sprache, published in 1868, it has become customary to insert a transitional period between Middle High German and New High German, which is referred to as Early New High German. Since then, there have been, and continue to be, numerous attempts to refine the canonical 4-period model, taking into specific account the fact that the German of 1650 may differ too much from the German of today to consider both language forms as being part of one and the same language period. Furthermore, models in general show a certain degree of abstraction. if the canonical periodization model defines Middle High German as spanning from 1050 to 1350, that does not mean that we assume all speakers of High German stopped using Middle High German on March the 24th, 1350, and from March 25th, 1351 started speaking early New High German. Rather, as will be shown during the lecture series, we have already seen how certain developments of the German linguistic system were rather asynchronous. For example, the diphthongization of the Middle High German long vowels, where Middle High German I, U, U became New High German I, Oi, Au, took place in the far southeast of the High German language area as early as the end of the 12th century, while in the northwest it was not complete until 400 years later. In the far southwest, it did not take hold at all. We will go into detail about this in the session on phonology and graphemics. The extent to which the New High German diphthongization took place has an impact on the phonemic systems of Middle High and Early New High German and is therefore one of the intra-linguistic criteria used for periodization. In order to delimit historical language stages, extra-linguistic criteria are also used, which can be historical, social, economic, or cultural in their nature. In many language histories, for example, the accession of Charles IV to the throne in Prague in 1346 is used as the criterion for the beginning of the early New High German language period and for the end of Middle High German, of course. Of course, internal and external language factors are inextricably linked, and when researching language change, it is not always clear what the chicken is and what the egg is. There have been several language historians, like Jakob Grimm, whom I just mentioned, who did not consider Middle High German to have ended around 1350, but instead 100 years later after the invention of the printing press. But did the standardization of writing caused by the printing press mean that linguistic variation became less common, or was there, conversely, a standardization tendency that was already present in the late manuscript culture that contributed to the acceptance of the new medium of printing? A language historian with a focus on media history would probably tend towards the first assumption, while a language historian oriented towards action theory would tend towards the second. Ultimately, all linguistic periodization models prove to be axiomatic and therefore relative. Now to the notion of space. The asynchronous distribution of the New High German diphthongization leads us to the second constituent of the expression Middle High German, the adjective high. Unlike in everyday language, where High German is used synonymously with Standard German, denoting the super-regional prestige variant of New High German, High German in linguistics refers to geography and denotes varieties in the south of the German language area. More precisely, south of the so-called Benrath line, the detail of which we will return to in a later session. All of the variants north of this linguistic border are referred to as Low German. Although looking at Low German and its historical language forms Old Saxon and Middle Low German would be worthwhile, in this lecture series we will deal exclusively with the history of medieval High German. The division of German into a northern and a southern variety is common in contemporary sources. One of the best-known metalinguistic statements about the German vernacular of the 13th century is the following sermon passage from Berthold von Regensburg, which dates to a period between 1250 and 1270. It explores the linguistic difference between speakers of Upper German and Low German. Translation left. Ihr wisset wohl, dass die Niederländer und die Oberländer gar ungleich sind an der Sprache und an den Sitten. Die von Oberland, dort her von Zürich, die reden viel anders, denn die von Niederlande, von Sachsen, die sind ungleich an der Sprache. Jedoch so redet ein Niederländer gar rechter als ein Oberländer etewenne. Und ist auch ein Niederländer als der Gleichsener und die Gleichsenerinne. Die gebahret rechte als sie gein Gott gehende Engele sehen, und sind doch Schelke und Schelkine. Somewhat frustratingly, handbooks of language history usually present this passage without its allegorical context. This ignores the fact that the north-south distinction, which is a perfectly valid linguistic distinction, is wrapped in a highly judgmental attitude. Berthold's sermon is not primarily concerned with language, but raises a much more important question, at least for non-linguists of the 13th century, who will be granted eternal salvation and who will be eternally damned. Low German speakers are compared to hypocrites who behave like angels but have the devil in them. Whether Berthold, a native speaker of Upper German, used the spatial metaphor high-low without any further ulterior motives, or whether Low German was actually considered to be a deficient linguistic form in the 13th century, cannot be clarified conclusively at this point. A somewhat different dialect, Middle Dutch, which is also based on the north-south geographical distinction, can be found in an often cited passage from the 13th century verse novella Helmbrecht by Werner de Gartenere. When Helmbrecht returns to his parents' farm, he wants to show off his familiarity with courtly culture by adorning his speech with all sorts of foreign language features, Flemish in particular, and features which sound similar, snacken instead of sagen, parrot instead of Pferd, weave instead of weep. One brief quote. Ei, was nacket ihr Gebure kin und jenes gunnährte wief, wien parret wienen klaren lief, sollte hein geburig manze Ware nimmer gegriepen an. Such Mischsprache does not seem to be approved of, as the narrative subsequently shows, since Helmbrecht achieved his ascent through illegitimate means, namely through robbery and murder, he ends up on the gallows. And finally, the third chapter, language. The third constituent of the compound Middle High German simply designates German. However, a closer look at the history of language shows that the expression encodes key information for the historical social linguistics of the Old and Middle High German vernacular. Etymologically speaking, German descends from the reconstructed Germanic term "fidiscus," an adjective meaning pertaining to the people. Our first attestation of the term appears in 768, when the papal envoy George of Ostia reports on synods held in Germanic tribal areas. Like many texts of its time, it's written, of course, in Latin. Singula capita per lecta sunt, et tam latine quam theodiscae, quo omnis intellegere posset. The adverb theodiscae refers here to the contrast between the official and prestigious Latin language and the language of the indigenous population, the so-called vernacular language. On this basis, it's clear we're dealing with languages rather than ethnic groups. A different shade of meaning can be found in a source from the year 842, the Strasbourg Oath, which also happens to be the oldest document we have written, at least in parts, in French. It says, ergo se decimas calendars Marcii lot vicus et Carolus in civitate quae olem argentaria vocabatur nunc autem Strasburg vulgo dicitur convenerunt. Et sacramenta quae subta notata sunt Ludovicus Romana Carolus vero toidisca lingua juaverunt. Here, the adjective toidisca still denotes the Germanic vernacular, but this time not in contrast to the superior language Latin. Instead, the contrast is with another vernacular tongue, Old French. We'll have to wait more than 200 years before we see further evidence of the use of theodiscae to express the concept of vernacular. In the early Middle High German Annulied, there is evidence both of the original meaning and two specific expansions in the semantic domain. Firstly, the expression Deutschen sprechen, to speak German, is metonymically transferred to the speakers of the language, Dütschü, Lütü, the German population, before being used to describe the territory inhabited by these speakers. That's in the third example, in Deutschem Lande, on the German territory. Based on the spectrum of usage of Deutsch as documented in the Annolid, we would determine that Middle High German was the language that was used between Old and early New High German in the Germanic settlement area, affected by the second consonant shift, whose inhabitants were characterized by the fact that, in certain situations, they did not use Latin, but a vernacular which was not French. The exact meaning of language still requires sociolinguistic specification. Unlike modern German, Middle High German is not a standard language, but what is meant by a standard language. We've already seen that the medieval German vernacular is characterized by substantial geographical differences. The main difference compared with later language period is that from the 11th to the 14th century there was no permanent national vernacular variety in addition to the regional varieties, the so-called written dialects, Schreibsprachen or Schreibdialekte, which are to be distinguished from Schriftsprachen, written standard varieties of Middle High German. The role of the supra-regional variety was partly subsumed by Latin in the Middle High German period, although its role diminished over time. We'll come back to that at a later stage. The reduction of regional diversity has also been shown to be a very slow process since, quote, the regional language variants were very well established through centuries of writing and language tradition, unquote, as Werner Besch states. I will make some attempt at establishing what super-regional varieties existed during the Middle High German period in the session on classical Middle High German, which covered the periods between 1170 to 1250 approximately. Given that Middle High German textual production was dominated by a copying tradition before the invention of the printing press, it is hardly surprising that we have no evidence of a standardized written form. Texts written in a particular regional form were adapted by scribes to their own regional variety, which results in several texts with mixed language forms. And this approach was more a rule than an exception. Just one brief example. In the Heidelberg Iwan manuscript of CPG 397, the Middle High German prefix ver appeared with 6 different spelling variants. On the one hand, the distribution of variants reflects the regional differentiation of Middle High German in the 13th century. Regional writing traditions can clearly be identified. The dominant variant, UIR, this one, which accounts for 70.4% of all occurrences, is a written form specific of Central Germany, which is helpful in tracing back the manuscript to the Central German, Low German border area. The range of variants of ver in CPG 397, however, came about numerous copying stages which transcended the linguistic borders and the sociolinguistic barriers that are characteristic of manuscript culture. Now, a final comment on the subject of standardization. If, as likely to be the case for students, your familiarity with Middle High German is not based on the manuscript tradition, but rather on the version of text found in the editions that have been produced since the 19th century, you may wonder what I've been talking about for the last few minutes. Most text editions use a standardized variety of Middle High German, which is often referred to in English as classical Middle High German. There are good reasons to use this artificially standardized language form in academic teaching and literature studies, and there are actually some manuscripts, especially from the 13th century, in which the language very closely resembles classical Middle High German. But we will come back to that in a future lecture. From a linguistic point of view, however, it is generally true that historical linguistic studies of Middle High German should be based on the actual handwritten tradition of the Middle Ages and not on a modern philological construct, primarily to avoid the false impression that there was a standard medieval German language. Well, that's enough of theory for now. In everyday academic practice, there are several barriers to teaching a non-standard language. There are many historical reasons for this. The usual approach for teaching dead languages such as Latin and ancient Greek has been to make students learn long lists of vocabulary and memorize tables of noun declensions and verb conjugations. Only after extensive rote learning is the opportunity provided to apply that lexical and grammatical knowledge in the form of textual translation. Already seen this. The unique selling point, so to speak, of the Alt- und Mittelhochdeutsch Arbeitsbuch, the 11th edition of which was recently published, has been to combine textual translation and grammar learning into a singular process, which was quite unusual for traditional medieval studies in the 1970s when the first edition of our textbook was published. Today, as far as I can see, this style is rather a matter of course, especially, you're lucky, in Britain. Just think of two textbooks are listed there, Young-Glonig, 2004, and Jones-Jones, 2019. It's beneath the computer. A happy byproduct of fusing grammar work and translations is that the variations of the Middle High German Schreibsprachen becomes much more obvious to the reader. At least I hope so. By this, I mean what follows. In the appendix of our textbook, you can find an excerpt from the 16th chapter of the Nibelungenlied, presented first in a normalized version. In addition to this, an entire chapter devoted to the variation found in the Middle High German tradition, using the example of stanza 979, makes it clear that the normalized text represents an abstraction from the manuscript tradition. Users can thus understand that variations of content between different versions are lost by normalized. While in manuscripts A and B, the Burgundian king Gunther bends down to drink, neigete. In manuscript C, he lies down on the ground, leggete. The primary benefit, however, is that variation can be seen across several linguistic domains: the graphemics, the phonology, the nominal morphology, and so on. In the morphology, we see variation in gender, which is not just typical for non-standard languages such as Middle High German, but also for German dialects of today. We'll stick with Middle High German. While the noun fluert is feminine in the manuscripts A and C, zu der Fluert, it inflects as masculine in manuscript B, zu dem fluert. In the case of high-frequency variants, these appear in the corresponding inflection tables. This applies, for example, to the disyllabic genitive and dative forms of the demonstrative pronoun, which usually are missing in introductions to Middle High German written by non-linguists who are insensitive to the particulars of a manuscript culture. So here you have all the important variants in our textbook, and these are two examples chosen more or less by chance, where you have just one form for each place of the paradigm. Due to its modular structure, however, our textbook can also be used by readers without substantial linguistic experience, for example, as a reference grammar when working on texts. This modular structure extends throughout the book. the approach used in teaching Middle High German is applied in the same way in the Old High German section. The textbook thus has appealed to those interested both in Middle High German and Old High German. Ideally, however, the analogous structure of the sections on Old and Middle High German should enable users to grapple with the general principles of historical phonology and morphology in German, and thus develop the skills to trace diachronic language change in general, which is what historical linguists are supposed to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Fascinating overview. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning, you will all be called to be critical readers and test readers for the next installment in this impressive series, namely the student version of Jones and Jones is coming out in April. So we'll use you with handouts as test readers for it, and in April, just in the North week of Trinity term, we'll probably have a one-day workshop presenting some of your essays based on the handbook and the student edition. So the language journey at teaching Middle High German goes on. Thanks for coming, and see you all at the latest next Friday. I can also recommend exploring this resource, Medieval OX AC UK, further. There is a wealth of things you can actively explore. For example, next week starts a reading group of medieval women's writing, which is convened by Marlene Schilling, another of our tutors for paper 4, and will allow you to link reading Middle High German with, if you are doing paper 6 with mysticism and medieval women's writing. So do explore more medieval.
See you next week.
Yeah.